Welcome to A Walk in Their Moccasins. This is mission 2 of level 3. All of level 3 is covered in your Indiana history textbook on pages 92 to 99. Last mission we talked about the French and how they interacted with the Native Americans. This mission we're going to talk about the British and how they interacted with the Native Americans. Our mission objective is to explain that relationship between the early British explorers and the historic tribes of Indiana. Our challenge questions, these are the most important questions in this mission that you'll need to answer at the end of our lesson, is where did the British settle in North America? Where were their settlements in North America when they came over here? How did the British interact with the Native Americans? What types of things did they do between each other? Did they like each other? Did they not like each other? Did they trade with each other? Did they avoid each other? Did they fight with each other? Those types of things. What were the main causes of the French and Indian War? So what happened to cause the French and Indian War? And how did life change for Native Americans after the French and Indian War? The French and Indian War happened. What happened as a result to Native Americans after that war ended? So those are our challenge questions. You'll answer them at the very end, and we'll cover all of those questions as we go forth. Our big question, what was life like for historic Native American tribes in Indiana, and how did they change after the arrival of the Europeans? Again, we've started to answer that question by talking about the French last mission, and we're going to answer it more fully today when we talk about the British. The British in North America, they followed suit with the French and Spanish and set up colonies in North America after it was discovered. They thought that these colonies would provide resources for England and opportunity for its people. The resources in North America, they didn't have some of those resources in England and Britain, so they thought that they could take some of those resources and take them over there and help out their own citizens, as well as provide opportunity for other people to come over here and live away from England. Roanoke Island, which is in present-day North Carolina, was the first British colony set up in North America. Unfortunately, this attempt was not successful and lasted only about a year. A second attempt was started a few years later by a man named John White. After arriving at the island with the other colonists, he returned to England for supplies. They didn't have enough, so he thought, I will go back and get some more. However, when he returned, the colony had mysteriously disappeared. To this day, no one knows what happened to the colonists he left behind, and it's a huge mystery. There's a lot of different theories about what happened, and if you ever wanted to do any research about it, you'd find out a lot of different theories about what happened to those first colonists who came there. Some think that maybe they had a disease and died. Some think that they might have been attacked by Native Americans. Some think that maybe they went and lived with the Native Americans. It's just a mystery. No one really knows for sure today. This picture shows what was on the tree, on one of the trees in the island when he returned. John White found only this tree carving. It says Croatoan. That's all he found. Nobody knows what it meant or knows what it means still to this day. It's a mystery. Jamestown was the first permanent British colony in North America. So Roanoke Island was the first settlement that was attempted in North America, but Jamestown was the first permanent, first one that lasted. And here you can see their location to each other, and the Roanoke Island was further south, the Jamestown colony was north in present-day Virginia. Colonists came from England to North America for 3 reasons. They were looking for riches and to make it become wealthy really quick, to claim land in the New World in order to limit Spanish and French power, because they wanted the British to have this land, so they came over here to take it away from the French and the Spanish. And they also might have wanted to come over here to start a new life and become more independent. Soon, many other British colonies outside of just Jamestown were started on the east coast of North America, and they began exploring into Indiana and trading there with Native Americans that were living in this region. When the British came to Indiana, their attitude towards Native Americans was very different than the French. The French, remember, they were very peaceful. They didn't want to cause any conflict. The British were the exact opposite of that. They showed very little respect to Native American traditions and only wanted to claim land that the Native Americans were living on and then to drive those Native Americans off their land. So the French and British had totally different attitudes toward how they would treat the Native Americans that they encountered when they came into Indiana. When the British arrived in Indiana, they knew that one great source of wealth was furs and hoped to have their own fur trade with Native Americans. We talked about the fur trade last mission and how important that was because those beaver furs were scarce in Europe and weapons were scarce for Native Americans. So there was a nice little trade between the French and the Native Americans. The British had hoped they could also get in on that trade to benefit themselves. However, this caused conflict with France because the Native Americans had only ever traded fur with the French. And as soon as they started to trade with the British, they began facing problems. The French were fighting their own war in Europe and had trouble getting the goods they needed to trade for fur. So Native Americans started to find more use in trading with the British because the French had some time that they were being tied up with this other war that was going on in France. And not all those resources, those guns, those weapons were actually able to get over to the Native Americans for them to sell, where the British had plenty of them, and so the Native Americans were becoming more willing to trade with them for that reason. British goods were not moved quick, or were moved quickly because they were not fighting a war, and the Native Americans were able to trade for these higher quality goods at a cheaper cost. So the British were starting to interfere to put their hand in this pot that the French and Native Americans had only been in, and the French didn't like that very much. British colonists were also wanting to settle and farm on land the French had already claimed. So the French were saying, hey, this is our land, but the British said, no, we're coming here too. We want this land just as much. So the French didn't like that as well. So you can start to see that they started to have these conflicts among each other. Here you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The French are over here in the blue. Notice Indiana, that's where we are. And the British are over here in the red. But then we have these little areas here that are intermingled with red and blue. That's where they both thought that they would have land. Up here in Canada too. And so that caused conflict between the two nations and the two groups of people, the French and the British, living in the New World. Pickawillany was a very important event in this time period because the quality and price of British goods tempted some Native Americans who had always been loyal to the French. The British were selling really good products. They were trading really good weapons and guns and things like that Native Americans wanted, and they were also asking also offering them at a cheaper price. So this really tempted some Native Americans, even though they had always sworn loyalty to the French. Some Miami, led by a chief named Domosale, led Kikianga and set up their own village in Ohio called Pickawillany, and there you see it on the map in Ohio. Soon, it became a very good trading post, and the Miami living there signed an agreement of friendship and trade with the British. So no longer were Native Americans strictly just trading with the French. Now they were strictly trading with the British. This agreement weakened the French control of the fur trade, and they didn't like that very much. So they had to respond in some way. In an effort to control the fur trade in the Ohio River Valley and keep their grip on the fur trade, the French built many forts. They built one near Lafayette in 1717. They built one in Fort Wayne in 1721. They built Fort Vincennes on the Wabash River in 1732, and it became the first permanent European settlement in Indiana. That will be important for you to know. Fort Vincennes was the first permanent European settlement in Indiana. As the British continued to trade with the Miamis at Pickawillany, the French saw their control of the fur trade slipping away, as we've said. As a result, they took action and attacked the British and the Miami that were living there destroying it and killing Chief Domicile. The Miami then were forced back to their old villages and had to return to Kikianga. And here you see a marker that if you traveled to Piccolini, you would see this marker that talks about what happened there. The French and Indian War. The bad feelings between the French and British turned into war by 1754. It was called the French and Indian War because the French and many Native Americans were fighting on one side, and the British and its colonists were fighting on the other side. And they actually had the better army and more supplies. They fought each other in battle for 9 years. The result of the war was the first major event that would lead to the eventual formation of the United States. So whoever wins this war is going to have a big say in how the United States is going to turn out. Outside of Indiana, the French built roads and forts in Pennsylvania to try to take land from the British that they wanted to get. Most of the fighting, however, took place in present-day New York and Canada. With the helps of the tribes like the Potawatomi, the French won many of the major battles the first 4 years. In Indiana, and there you can see a map of the different battles that took place. In Indiana, British troops took control of Fort Miami and Fort Irotonin, giving them control of the Wabash River and the fur trade. Once the British had control of these lands, they were able to force the French to leave and abandon their control of the fur trade. So that was a very important victory for the British. The Treaty of Paris would mark the end of the war because in 1763 the British won this war. And the French and British signed the Treaty of Paris, giving French land in Canada and east of the Mississippi to the British. Here you can see on the left, this was before the war. On the right is after the war and how much land the British had gained. The British are in purple, so look at how much land they gained from winning the war. Had the French won the French and Indian War, the whole history of our country would be very different. But they didn't, so we won, the British won, and so now we have our nation's history now. That's why we speak English instead of French. Pontiac's War. Native Americans did not want the British taking over their lands. Even though that they had won these lands from the French, some Native Americans still didn't want them to do that. That's because they wanted to build these settlements on their land and force the Native Americans to move out. Remember, they didn't have a good relationship with them, really. An Ottawa chief named Pontiac led the Miami, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, and the Lenape in a rebellion against the British. At first, they were successful at capturing some British forts, but the British were much too powerful. Here you can see on the map the different battles that were fought during Pontiac's War. The British wanted to keep peace and to avoid further conflict. They didn't like having all this attacks take place by Native Americans. They wanted to keep peace. They just won the war. They didn't want to get in another war. So they wanted to avoid further conflict. In 1763, King George III of Britain issued a proclamation stating that no colonist could move to the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Only Native Americans could live on those lands. And you can see right there on the map where that proclamation line was. It's in red. So no British colonists could live west of that line, according to the proclamation of 1763. Only Native Americans, and they did this to ensure that Native Americans wouldn't cause any more conflict. This is the end of Mission 2. We will have a review video that follows this, but you need to do some studying on your own. Make sure that you're ready for Mission 2, and then for the level up, and then finally for the boss level that will follow this. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.